The ship creaked against the gray Atlantic swell, its metal belly heavy with passengers who were neither immigrants nor tourists, but prisoners of war. They huddled on the deck, women in drab uniforms, their hair tied back, their eyes hollow with fatigue. They had left behind a defeated homeland where the ruins still smoked, where hunger gnawed like a wolf at every door. Each carried the weight of an uncertain fate. Some expected ridicule, others cruelty, and many imagined chains and the cold silence of isolation. But as the American shoreline rose into view, New York Harbor, with its forest of cranes and shimmering skyline, they found themselves staring not at humiliation but at something far stranger. At first, it was the sound that unsettled them. The whine of taxis below the piers, the horns of ships, the casual laughter that drifted from the docks. It was laughter that did not hide behind clenched teeth, laughter without fear of being overheard. They had grown used to whispers in Germany, of rationing, of bomb raids, of denunciations. Here, the air itself seemed louder, freer, and unafraid. When the gangway was lowered, the women descended cautiously, clutching what little they possessed. American guards stood waiting, but their posture was not that of conquerors brandishing rifles. Instead, some were distractedly smoking cigarettes, others joking with dockworkers. The German women prepared themselves for the sting of insults, the slap of hands that might force them into lines. Yet instead, they saw something that rattled them more than hostility ever could. American women, confident and commanding, standing at the edge of the pier with clipboards. One woman wore trousers rolled at the cuffs, her sleeves pushed up as she shouted instructions to the men beside her. Another carried a stack of papers thicker than a Bible and barked orders that even the guards obeyed. The German POWs froze. In their world, uniforms meant authority, and authority belonged to men. But here were women, casual as if it were natural, telling soldiers where to march prisoners, directing traffic of crates and luggage, correcting clerks who fumbled paperwork. A nurse with a Red Cross armband brushed past them, handing out cups of coffee. She smiled, not with pity, not with menace, but with a brisk professionalism. One German prisoner, a nurse herself who had served in a military hospital, looked at her and thought bitterly of how in Germany she had been little more than a shadow at the edge of a ward, valued only for obedience. To see her American counterpart walk with such certainty was like being struck in the chest. The women whispered to each other in hushed German, questions tumbling faster than answers. Could this be allowed? Were these women truly permitted to speak this way, to command, to walk beside men without bowing their heads? It felt indecent, yet exhilarating, like watching someone break a rule so deeply ingrained you had forgotten it was written. The harbor itself became a stage. Trucks rattled across cobblestones, driven not only by men but also by women in caps and overalls. A girl no older than 19 maneuvered a vehicle loaded with crates, her jaw clenched, her knuckles sure. The German women stared, their thoughts flickering back to propaganda posters of blonde housewives holding loaves of bread beneath swastikas. Those posters had told them where their worth belonged. But the scene in front of them told a different story altogether. One prisoner, barely 20, clutched the handrail tighter. She remembered her mother weeping when her older brother had gone to war, how neighbors had assured them that women were meant to endure, not to lead. Watching the dockyard unfold, she felt something she could not name, part envy, part disbelief, part yearning so sudden it left her breathless. The guards herded them into trucks bound for inland camp. The journey carried them through towns where shop windows displayed more abundance than the German women had seen in years. Shelves of canned goods, bolts of fabric, shoes polished and new. But what made their eyes widen most was not the goods but the customers. Women, young and old, stood at counters counting out dollars, their voices confident as they made purchases without a husband or father at their side. One POW murmured, "They are free to buy what they wish." Another shook her head, disbelieving. In Germany, ration cards had been stamped under the watchful gaze of officials, every loaf of bread a negotiation. Here, commerce itself seemed casual and unguarded, and women moved within it as equals. The trucks rumbled past a schoolyard where children played, their laughter shrill and carefree. Outside the fence stood mothers, some holding infants, some chatting with neighbors, one even pulling a notebook from her handbag and scribbling something with brisk determination. A POW with a background in teaching watched with silent awe. In Germany, schools had been instruments of ideology, every lesson a sermon of loyalty. Yet here, the women at the fence spoke as though their voices carried weight. She wondered what it would mean to speak so freely without consequence. As the convoy pushed deeper into the American landscape, the countryside opened like a painting, fields dusted with early frost, barns painted red, telephone wires strung taut across the sky. To the German women, the sheer order of it felt uncanny. War had scarred their homeland into rubble and silence. Here, even the barns looked defiant, standing tall and unbroken. But again, it was the people who shook them most. Women on tractors guiding plows, women in kerchiefs lifting bales of hay, their hands calloused, their posture proud. In the camps, barbed wire fences waited. They reminded the prisoners that they were captives, not visitors. Yet even inside, the presence of American women remained impossible to ignore. Female guards checked rolls, Red Cross volunteers oversaw distribution of blankets, and camp secretaries typed reports with authority. Each encounter whispered a subversive message. Here, women spoke, decided, and led. At night, lying on cots beneath the drafty barracks roof, the German POWs whispered their astonishment. Some dismissed it as American eccentricity. Others muttered that such freedom would breed chaos. But more than a few, staring into the dark, felt something dangerous stirring, a question they had never dared form before. What if women could be more than silent witnesses? What if this was not weakness but strength? The shock of their arrival was not only the realization of defeat but the confrontation with a world inverted. They had come expecting punishment, but instead they were confronted by a freedom that unsettled them far more than cruelty would have. The clang of the camp gates each night reminded them they were prisoners, yet beyond those gates moved women who seemed freer than any German man had ever allowed them to be. And as the days unfolded, the dissonance only grew sharper. For the first time, these women began to suspect that captivity might reveal something more powerful than chains. What they had seen at the harbor was not just a different nation, it was a different possibility, and it would haunt them long after the fences closed around them. Life in the American camps unfolded with a rhythm that at first felt alien. Every morning the German women awoke to the clang of bells and the distant hum of trucks beyond the wire. They expected harshness, but the rules were methodical, almost bureaucratic: work details, mealtimes, inspections. Yet what unsettled them most was not the fences or the guards, but the glimpses of American life just beyond. The barbed wire was like a theater curtain, and through it they watched a performance that contradicted everything they had been told about what women should be. In Germany, ideology had carved womanhood into a narrow mold. Kinder, Kusch, Kirche, children, kitchen, church. Posters had promised honor in obedience, dignity in silence. A good German woman was a mother and a caretaker, little else. Yet here in America, the war had rewritten gender lines in ink so bold it could not be ignored. By 1944, 6 million American women worked in factories. They assembled airplanes, riveted steel, and filled the roles men had abandoned when they marched to Europe. The German POWs saw their images in newspapers delivered to the camps: women with hair tied back in scarves, hands smudged with grease, faces shining with determination. Rosie the Riveter was no myth to them, she was everywhere. The contrast gnawed like hunger. One prisoner, a 30-year-old who had once been proud of her efficiency in rationing her family's bread back in Stuttgart, stared at a photograph of women lined up at a Detroit assembly line. She whispered that in Germany, she had never touched a machine more complex than a sewing wheel. Another, younger, confessed that she had envied her brothers for being allowed to study while she had been steered toward household service. To see American girls with books in their arms, walking freely into universities, felt like watching someone break through a wall she had not realized was there. The camp library carried donated American magazines. Though censored, they brimmed with images that to the German women looked almost like propaganda in reverse. There were advertisements of women smiling beside cars they themselves drove, wives deciding what brand of refrigerator to purchase, young students laughing as they stepped out of lecture halls. The POWs lingered over these pages, their fingers tracing the photographs as if trying to feel whether they were real. Some dismissed them with nervous laughter, insisting America was surely decadent, that this was all a charade. But the seed of doubt was already planted. One afternoon, from behind the wire, the prisoners watched as a farm family nearby delivered supplies. The farmer's wife climbed down from the wagon first. She wore trousers patched at the knees, her hair tied back in a kerchief. She spoke to the guards directly, bargaining over the weight of potatoes, even correcting a miscount. Her husband stood silently behind, nodding when she made her point. The German women exchanged glances, their eyes wide. In their world, the man would have spoken, the woman would have nodded. Here, it seemed reversed. A young POW muttered that if she had ever spoken over her father, she would have been slapped silent. Yet this American woman's voice carried without hesitation. Letters home, heavily censored, still carried fragments of astonishment. One German nurse wrote that she had seen women in uniform walking beside men, without shame, as if they belonged there. Another described the sound of women laughing loudly in town, not hushed or modest, but unafraid. These testimonies, though stripped of detail by censors, preserved the awe that rippled through the camps. The German women were not only seeing another country, they were seeing another possibility for themselves. The irony was sharp, and the narration of history could not resist it. In Germany, women had been glorified as the bearers of the nation's future, yet stripped of agency. They had been told they were sacred while being denied voice. In America, women were not wrapped in the same rhetoric, yet here they welded airplanes, earned paychecks, and studied law. The German prisoners, caught between two worlds, could not ignore the contradiction. Still, disbelief lingered. Some insisted this was temporary, that once the men returned, American women would be pushed back into kitchens. They laughed bitterly at the thought that trousers and clipboards could survive peace. But even those who scoffed felt something stirring. A prisoner admitted under her breath that she envied the American women not for their work, but for the way men listened when they spoke. That detail, more than any, seemed to pierce the German worldview like sunlight through a shutter. The conflict deepened at mealtimes, where American women volunteers from the Red Cross supervised distribution. One POW remembered a volunteer, young and brisk, who insisted on fairness when a guard attempted to cut corners. She argued calmly yet firmly, and the guard relented. The German women whispered about it for days. Authority here did not depend on brute force or hierarchy, but on confidence, and it could belong to a woman. There were moments of humor too, though edged with envy. A German prisoner once tried to mimic an American accent after overhearing a secretary bark an order. Her friends collapsed into laughter at the garbled attempt, but beneath the amusement lingered longing. They laughed because to imitate was safer than to admit desire. The mirror grew sharper as time wore on. Inside the camp, German women still lived under discipline, their days structured, their roles confined. Outside, American women drove tractors, taught classes, and debated politics. The prisoners were trapped between two realities, one enforced by wire, the other glimpsed just beyond it. And with every glimpse, the wire seemed thinner. The personal became ideological. The German women began to wrestle silently with what they had been taught. If America could trust women with machines, money, and decisions, then perhaps the rules they had lived under were not laws of nature but laws of men. This thought was both liberating and terrifying. To believe it meant admitting their own subjugation, and once admitted, it could not be forgotten. One evening, as the sun set behind the camp, painting the sky a bruised violet. A young prisoner leaned against the fence and watched headlights crawl along a nearby road. She saw a woman at the wheel, hair streaming in the wind. The image etched itself into her mind. She whispered to her bunkmate that she would remember that sight forever, a woman steering her own course. The words hung between them, fragile but electric, a confession of yearning disguised as observation. The mirror of two worlds was not just a contrast of nations, it was a confrontation of identities. These German women had been raised to believe their silence was virtue, their obedience strength. Yet in America they saw voices raised without shame, choices made without permission. Each day in captivity revealed not chains but contradictions, and each contradiction chipped away at the certainty they had carried across the ocean. And though some clung stubbornly to the old doctrines, many could not shake the suspicion that what they were witnessing was not temporary, not superficial, but something deeper, a foundation on which a different kind of life could be built. It was a realization both intoxicating and dangerous. For if women could command trucks, clipboards, and classrooms in America, what would happen when these prisoners returned to a Germany where silence was demanded of them again? The question lingered like smoke in the air, and though no one spoke it aloud, its presence was undeniable. The mirror did not just reflect America, it reflected what they themselves might become. The days in the camps fell into a rhythm, yet within that rhythm the German women found themselves confronted by lessons they had not expected to learn. At first, they thought the novelty of American women's authority would fade, that their astonishment would soften into indifference. But the opposite occurred. Each new encounter with American women deepened the sense that they were living inside a quiet classroom of freedom, a place where the smallest gestures carried messages larger than speeches. Work details became the first arena of revelation. Many POWs were sent to nearby farms to ease the labor shortage, and there they met American wives who ran entire households in their husbands' absence. The sight was disarming. A 35-year-old German widow remembered standing in the cold fields, hoe in hand, while the farm's mistress directed both men and women with a tone that carried no apology. She corrected a guard on the weight of grain, she dismissed excuses with a flick of her wrist, and when a tractor broke down, she climbed into the machinery herself and repaired it with practiced ease. The POWs watched her oil-stained hands and realized she was no exception. She was the rule in this place. Within the camp itself, Red Cross volunteers arrived with boxes of supplies. Blankets, soap, even books. One young American woman with spectacles perched on her nose greeted the prisoners not as inferiors but with the brisk courtesy of a librarian organizing her shelves. She handed out novels, some of them written by women, and her authority over the distribution was unchallenged. The German POWs whispered afterward that she carried herself like a schoolteacher, but in Germany, a schoolteacher still deferred to male inspectors. Here, this woman deferred to no one. The lessons multiplied in subtle ways. A secretary in the commandant's office, her typewriter keys clacking like gunfire, interrupted an officer mid-sentence when he misstated a number. She did not flinch when he frowned, but simply repeated the corrected figure until he conceded. A nurse in the infirmary scolded a soldier for negligence, and he accepted her rebuke without anger. Even a guard's wife, visiting with a basket of food, spoke freely before her husband, debating politics while he listened in silence. To the German women, every such moment was a small earthquake, a shattering of assumptions they had thought immovable. Conversations among the POWs became confessions of envy and doubt. One recalled her mother's words, "A woman's strength is patience." Yet here, strength seemed to mean something different: action, decision, voice. Another admitted she had once prayed her daughters would be obedient wives. Now she wondered if obedience was truly a virtue at all. The barracks at night buzzed with whispered reflections, as if the women were trying to piece together a puzzle that had been hidden from them their entire lives. The American women, often unaware of the silent revolutions they sparked, continued their work without ceremony. Some brought music into the camp, jazz records spinning, voices crooning in smoky tones. A German nurse, tending to a sick companion, listened to Ella Fitzgerald's voice drifting from a guard's radio and thought it sounded like liberty itself, warm and unashamed. Another time, POWs witnessed a town hall gathering from the back of a truck. Through the open windows they heard women's voices arguing fiercely about ration distribution and school funding. No one silenced them. The German prisoners exchanged stunned glances. In their homeland, such public boldness from women would have been dismissed as hysterical or even punished. Humor surfaced too, though edged with longing. One prisoner attempted to mimic the stride of an American woman she had seen on the street, shoulders back, chin high, steps brisk and unapologetic. Her companions giggled at the performance, but the laughter quickly melted into a hush, as if acknowledging that what they mocked was what they secretly desired. They laughed because it was safer than admitting the yearning. Each day sharpened the conflict inside them. They were still prisoners, bound by wire and watched by guards. Yet outside the fence, American women moved as if the world itself were theirs to command. The German women could not escape the irony. In captivity, they were witnessing a freedom they had never tasted at home. And the more they witnessed it, the harder it became to dismiss it as an anomaly. Some wrote about it in their diaries, scribbling between censored lines. One entry read, "They are not afraid to speak. Even when men disagree, their voices are not silenced." Another confessed, "Perhaps our silence was never strength but surrender." These words, fragile yet defiant, marked a transformation that could not be undone. The metaphor of the camp gates lingered in their minds. Each morning, the gates swung open to let them march to work, and each evening they clanged shut again. Yet beyond those gates lay images that slipped into their dreams: a woman at a tractor's wheel, another counting bills at a store counter, another standing in a classroom full of children. The gates kept their bodies confined, but their imaginations slipped through the bars. By winter, even small interactions carried weight. A POW thanked an American volunteer for soap, and the woman replied, "Everyone deserves dignity." The words were simple, but to the prisoner they were thunderous. She repeated them later to her barracks companions, who sat in silence, unable to dismiss the possibility that dignity was not a privilege bestowed by men but a right inherent to all. The quietest among them began to change in subtle ways. A shy woman who had once bowed her head in every conversation started to meet others' eyes when she spoke. A widow who had accepted silence as her lot began to question orders more directly, sometimes earning reprimands but no longer fearing them. Each shift was small, almost invisible, but together they formed a current that carried the women toward something unspoken but undeniable. And yet, beneath the admiration lay fear. They knew the war would end, that they would be returned to a Germany still ruled by ruins and old expectations. What would happen when they stepped back into a society that demanded their silence again? Could they forget what they had seen, the authority in an American woman's voice, the freedom in her stride? The question lingered over every conversation, pressing against their ribs like a hidden blade. The lessons they absorbed in captivity were not merely curiosities, they were provocations. Every clipboard, every tractor, every raised female voice became a reminder that the boundaries drawn around them at birth were not unbreakable. And though none of them could say it aloud without trembling, the thought grew stronger each day: if American women could live this way, perhaps they could too. It was a dangerous thought, more dangerous than barbed wire or guard towers, because it promised a future their captors had never intended to give them. And as the war edged toward its conclusion, the women began to realize that captivity itself was transforming them. They had come expecting punishment, but what they were receiving was an education. And like any true education, it carried with it a burden they could never unlearn. The night air in the barracks grew thick with this unspoken tension. One woman whispered that when she returned home, she would never again bow her head at the dinner table. Another warned her to be careful, that Germany would not tolerate such defiance. But the first only smiled in the darkness and said, then let Germany change. The words hung like sparks in the silence. They were whispered, but they did not fade. And as the weeks slipped by, the German POWs understood something with mounting clarity. The greatest shock was not that America had captured them, but that America was quietly liberating them in ways they had never imagined. What they had learned behind wire would follow them back across the ocean, and it would not let them rest. When the war ended, the camps began to empty. The German women, once so certain they would never see their homeland again, now faced repatriation. The trucks that had once brought them into captivity now carried them away, back toward a Europe scarred and fractured. Yet as they prepared to cross the ocean once more, many realized that they were not returning as the same women who had left. The fences had held their bodies, but their minds had wandered beyond them, and what they carried back was less visible than scars but far more enduring. The voyage across the Atlantic was heavy with memory. They leaned on the ship's railing, staring at the gray water, but their thoughts lingered on the fields where American women had driven tractors, the classrooms where young girls carried books, the town halls where mothers argued over policy. These images clung to them like contraband hidden in the folds of their clothing. One prisoner murmured that she feared the return more than she had feared capture, for captivity had given her glimpses of freedom that her homeland might never allow. Another confessed she would rather remain behind the American fences than step back into a life where her voice meant nothing. Their words, whispered against the crash of waves, carried the weight of a secret pact, to remember. When they disembarked onto the ruins of Germany, the contrast was devastating. Streets still gaped with bomb craters. Buildings stood as skeletons of brick and steel. Food was scarce, and hope scarcer still. Men returned from the front broken or not at all, and the old hierarchies rushed to reassert themselves. The women's families expected them to bow their heads again, to slip silently into kitchens and laundry rooms, to rebuild the nation with patience but without complaint. Yet something in them resisted. They had seen another way, and the memory pulsed beneath every command to stay quiet. One woman, once timid, now argued openly with her father about how rations should be divided. Another, a nurse who had watched American counterparts take charge in hospitals, refused to defer to the village doctor when she knew his treatment was wrong. A widow, who had whispered in the barracks that obedience might not be strength, told her children stories of American women who worked machines and held money in their own hands. Her sons laughed, calling it fantasy, but her daughter listened in silence, her eyes shining with a dangerous curiosity. Germany itself, broken and occupied, began to change in ways both subtle and sweeping. In 1949, West German women were granted the vote. Across the ruins, women worked not just as caretakers but as builders, clearing rubble from streets with bare hands, standing in lines for jobs once reserved for men. The POWs who had returned from America watched these shifts with a strange recognition. For them, the sight of women lifting bricks or signing ballots was not shocking but familiar, echoes of what they had seen across the Atlantic. They whispered that perhaps the seeds planted in captivity were beginning to bloom, even here among the ashes. Yet it was not easy. Families resisted. Communities mocked. Old expectations clung tightly, like ivy on a ruined wall. Some women bent under the pressure, burying their memories beneath duty. But others could not forget. In private moments, they repeated the phrases they had heard in America. Everyone deserves dignity. They mimicked the strides of women walking boldly down streets. They pictured the farm wives bargaining without fear. They recalled the sound of typewriter keys hammering authority into paper. These recollections became their armor against silence, even when the world around them insisted they return to obedience. The transformation was not uniform, but it was undeniable. A woman who once laughed nervously at the sight of trousers now bought a pair and wore them while clearing rubble. Another, who had seen American mothers speaking at school boards, began to press her local council for better rations for children. These acts were small, almost invisible against the scale of destruction, but they were acts of defiance nonetheless. Each gesture, each voice raised, each choice made without permission was a thread pulled from the fabric of the old order. The metaphor of seeds carried itself across continent. In the soil of American captivity, ideas had been planted. They were carried back not in suitcases but in memory, invisible yet impossible to kill. And like seeds, they sprouted slowly, pushing against the rubble, fragile yet insistent. Even decades later, when Germany rebuilt into a new nation, the women who had once stared in awe at clipboards and tractors remembered the first shock of that freedom and understood that they had been witnesses to something larger than a single war. Not all of them would speak of it. Some buried their astonishment in silence, fearing ridicule. Others shared only in fragments, telling their daughters' stories disguised as curiosities. In America, women could drive alone, or in America, women could speak to men without bowing. To the daughters, these fragments sounded like myths, but to the mothers they were proof of another world, carried back across the ocean like smuggled light. Historians would later call these transformations subtle, difficult to trace. But the women themselves knew better. They had felt the shift inside their bones. They had stood on docks watching women with clipboards command soldiers. They had watched headlights crawl along roads with women at the wheel. They had heard voices raised in laughter and debate without fear. These were not abstractions, they were memories carved deep, and they could not be erased by rubble or silence. And so, the story of captivity became more than a tale of barbed wire and guard towers. It became a paradox. In the very place designed to hold them powerless, the German women had encountered power in its most unexpected form. Their chains had been real, yet what had bound them more tightly was the ideology they carried from home. America had not shattered those chains with violence but with visibility, with women who lived as though equality were natural, inevitable, and unquestionable. Years later, some of those former POWs would confess that the true humiliation was not defeat but recognition, realizing they had been denied a dignity that had always been theirs to claim. Yet that recognition was also liberation, for once seen, it could not be unseen. Once believed, it could not be forgotten. As the narration closes, one imagines a woman standing again at a harbor, decades older, watching ships drift against the horizon. She remembers the first time she stepped onto American soil, braced for punishment but met instead by women who laughed, commanded, and lived unafraid. That memory remains her quiet rebellion, her proof that dignity is not granted by nations but carried within. And if captivity could reveal that truth, what might freedom yet demand of her?